In the skies above China, a prototype military aircraft was recently captured on camera during a rare daytime flight that appeared to show their top secret 6th generation J-36 fighter. If this prototype legitimately has the capabilities that these new images suggest that it has, then it could mean that the Chinese Air Force is leaps ahead in development than some previously thought. But what exactly are we seeing here? Is this a new Chinese fighter, some kind of mini bomber, or is it a copycat of an existing American aircraft? People that were watching on the ground near the Chengdu Aircraft Corporation factory airfield were able to capture these never before seen high definition images of the J-36. But choosing to reveal these images is always a double-edged sword because it gives us insight into how the plane might be used in combat. Let's first talk about what we've learned about its weapon systems, because if you're like me, that's what makes you hua the hardest. But before we get into that, I noticed that one of the things you guys always tell me in the comment section is how you appreciate that I try my best to stay objective and unbiased with reporting. Ground News is a website and an app that gathers news from all over the world and it puts it in one place. Then it gives me a clear way to navigate how every story is being told from different perspectives. For instance, I recently covered how the United States plans to destroy cartel terrorists, right? And there was a ton of information for me to sort through. Thanks to Ground News though, I can quickly cut to the heart of the story, like this one, about the United States deploying spy planes to surveil Mexican drug cartels. Out of the 40 plus sources covering that story, Ground News shows me that most come from centrist outlets. But my favorite part is their interactive map feature that lets me explore news from all over the world. We're offering 40% off their Vantage plan at groundnews.com/task. This is a great discount on their best plan, exclusive to you Task and Purpose viewers, so I really recommend you give Ground News a shot by clicking the link in the description down below or the pinned comment below. Take a look at the underbelly, the soft, exposed, and vulnerable part, most delicate part of the J-36. They reveal an internal weapons bay that if we measure it, it's about 6 meters long or 19 feet. And wouldn't you know it, in October 2022, the Chinese Air Force had just released their long-range air-to-air missile, the PL-17, and it just so happens that that missile is also roughly 6 meters long or 19 feet. Color me shocked. These are beyond visual range, active radar-guided missiles, and according to the Royal United Services Institute, they can hit targets out to about 400 kilometers, although I've seen other sources place it at like 500 kilometers, which is like 300 miles. Let's just say it's in that range and give me a little bit of leeway here. To give some reference, the distance from mainland China to Japan is only 500 miles. But it could also be potentially configured to carry a large air-to-surface bomb. If we make an educated guess based on the size of the weapons bay, it could carry China's YJ-100 long-range air-launched cruise missile that has a range of 900 miles. This would be used for precision strikes against high-value targets, including ships and ground installations. Why is that important to note? Because it's likely, in the event of war in the Pacific, the first tactic that China would use with this J-36 would be to strike targets in Japan and South Korea. And that's a major hint as to how they might use this aircraft. Okay, so an important air combat concept that we need to understand is something called kinematic qualities. Kinematic qualities of a weapon refers to the speed, altitude, and angle of the launching platform at the time of the missile's release. To maximize its kill potential, if the jet is already moving fast and it has a high altitude, then the missile gets a buff. It gets a multiplier effect to its range and speed. But it's not just that big main weapons bay that it uses. There are two smaller weapons bays that could be given a range of smaller munitions. But the type of weapons that it will ultimately carry is going to probably depend on the role that it ends up filling. As of time of publishing this video, none of its specs have been leaked on War Thunder, so we don't know for sure yet. And herein lies the question that fascinates me. Will the J-36 be a bomber, a fighter, or a multi-role jet? What in God's good name are we looking at here? I know a lot of people in the comments say that I always just say China weapons bad, US weapons good, but it's not that simple. I don't think that's true. I find Chinese history and their people fascinating. I find researching their military engaging, otherwise I wouldn't do it. I view China as a rival and an adversary, so of course I poke fun here and there. But at the end of the day, my goal here isn't to just shit on a Chinese airplane for the sake of shitting on a Chinese airplane. What's the value in that? My goal here is to actually look at the facts and expert opinions on it. To try to reverse engineer the J-36 role, we need to look at what we can learn based on her shapes. One of the first things you'll notice is that the Chinese J-36 is basically just a flat flying triangle, aka a delta wing configuration for people who have that type of aviationism. This tells us two key factors. One, it's a stealth jet, no surprise there, and two, it's designed for endurance at supersonic speeds. One of the biggest trade-offs when you design your aircraft like a flying Dorito is that they don't do well for subsonic or slower than speed of sound, and they tend to be a bit heavier with all the drawbacks that come with that. The extra weight is definitely something to be considered here because this aircraft is pretty massive. From the pictures, it appears to be at least as long as the 70-foot nose to tail of the J-20, but significantly wider. There are a couple reasons why you'd want to make an aircraft that large. The first and simplest reason is that you can fit more stuff into it, like sensors and weapon systems, but more importantly, and this is really what we're going to dive into, is its fuel. It can carry more fuel. Aviation experts like Tyler Rodgeway at the War Zone believes that fuel aspect is critical with understanding the J-36's role, because combining the size and shape of the aircraft tells us that its purpose is to have a long combat radius as possible. Basically, how far it can fly before it has to turn around and get gas. You can have the stealthiest jet in the world, but if it has to hook up to a tanker to refuel every couple of hours, you might as well cover it in PT belts.
If I'm gonna be a dad, I'm gonna do dad jokes.
Why is added distance more important for China specifically? It's not impossible, but unlikely that they would be doing flying bombing missions far away from China. Their focus is likely on Taiwan, only 100 miles away. On the tactical level, this increased range would allow the Chinese Air Force to position the J-36 further inland, which keeps them further away from the United States and its allies' ground-launched cruise missiles. With the aircraft positioned deeper inside China, potentially, it would be more safe and difficult to hit while it's at its most vulnerable on the ground. Sure, America's B-21 or B-1 could still reach it anywhere in China, but they would have to run the gauntlet of flying over enemy airspace for longer periods of time. I can't show jets getting blown up in giant fireballs here on YouTube, but I did a collaboration with Habitual Line Crosser where we analyze uncensored combat footage of fighter jets being shot down out of the sky by missiles. He's an active duty US Army Patriot missile air defender, so he knows what he's talking about. And the link is in the description to Pepperbox. You get a free 2-week trial, and then it's $7.99 a month after that if you want to stick around for my weekly exclusive combat footage analysis that's too spicy for here. You also get exclusive content from Fat Electrician, Angry Cops, and much more. Fuel capacity is a huge priority for their Air Force specifically. And if you look at Chinese aircraft specifications versus Western equivalents, you might be surprised to find that a lot of times they have longer ranges. And there's always a trade-off for that, but that's what they prioritize a lot. The reason for this is because China's tanker fleet, their aerial refuel fleet, is both really old and really small. They're working on building a new tanker fleet with their Y-20 aircraft, but it won't be up to speed for a decade or so. The Chinese Air Force has to be incredibly conservative when it comes to deploying them because of how comically large targets they make. It's fair to estimate that this aircraft will have a range of up to around 1,800 kilometers. The reason I say that is because their J-20 maxes out at around 1,200 kilometers, and that carries significantly less fuel. American NGADs, or the 6th generation, next generation aircraft, are expected to have around 1,500 kilometers of range, and the Chinese aircraft generally have a longer combat radius than their American counterparts. Noticeably gone from this aircraft, though, is any kind of tail or vertical stabilizers. This usually helps with keeping the plane off of radars, and it helps decrease air drag, but at the cost of, well, pretty much everything else. Flying wing type designs are notoriously hard to control, even when the plane is just cruising around, and the computer controls and the avionics will be doing a majority of the heavy lifting in keeping this thing stable. But it largely means that it's probably not designed to go toe-to-toe with other aircraft. Instead, the goal is going to be to either stay undetected and avoid a fight, or to shoot and scoot at enemy aircraft from incredibly long distances before they can react. Whenever I try to understand China's perspective on something from their own point of view, I go to Zhao Da Shui on X. They're a self-proclaimed member of the People's Armed Police Propaganda Bureau. It's like getting to read your adversary's diary to know all their deepest, darkest thoughts. It's basically Chinese Communist Party propaganda in purely distilled, concentrated form, but it's still worth reading to see what they think of their aircraft from their perspective. Zhao said, quote, "Now that our 6th generation fighters are made public, the sale of the 5th generation fighters to Pakistan is a done deal. By having the PLA Air Force 2 generations ahead of the Indian Air Force, with the Pakistani Air Force 1st generation ahead of India, would ensure proper strategic containment of India. A strong alliance in South Asia, including Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Sri Lanka, will negate any form of sabotaging attempts against the global South by the US via their clients in India." End quote. So it's interesting to see China likely sees this fighter as a way to sell aircraft to Pakistan and to contain India. This raises an important question of production. Let's assume the J-36 aircraft is everything they claim it to be and more. Let's assume it's an absolute miracle of an aircraft. There's still the question of, can it be produced at large scale, or is it a prototype meant more for public relations purposes? I want to warn you that we are about to walk into a long contested and long running debate about exactly how effective these Chinese aircrafts really are. There have been attempts to reverse engineer its abilities based on other factors. For instance, we know for a fact that the Chinese Communist Party has long run a program for many years where they've offered large sums of money to former US military pilots to train their Chinese pilots. The US government has arrested former pilots for training Chinese military pilots. This would suggest to me China is still behind the US in trying to learn some of those pilot skills. Just the fact that it flew in daytime, in public, while there happen to be a ton of people on the ground filming and posting videos online, isn't a coincidence. Even this tells us something. It's almost certain that China specifically wanted these images out in the public as a way of claiming that their plane is an actual threat and that it's ahead of the timeline of the American 6th generation fighter. So a little bit of a PR war going on here. Xi Jinping might as well be looking straight at us and saying, hey, look at my shiny new toy. Right after the test flight took place, the United States Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Acquisition Technology and Logistics, Andrew Hunter, acknowledged that the Chinese J-36 might reach initial operational capability before the American 6th generation fighter program does. But he believed that the US Air Force would have better capability because of the Air Force's technical advantages. It's like my old squad leader used to always say, it's not about who gets there first, it's about who gets there best. Oftentimes, this news of new Chinese or Russian equipment comes out. The US military then kind of uses it as an excuse to get a blank check from the military-industrial complex. Even the United States military that has hundreds of 5th generation combat aircraft proven in combat, they have a whole fleet. They're currently struggling with their own 6th generation aircraft. The US just recently announced they were stopping further production on the 6th gen aircraft until the new administration comes in and decides what to do with the program. The fact that it's called the 6th generation aircraft is even kind of a gray area. Tactically speaking, what we expect from a J-36, if it's a 6th gen, is that most 6th generation combat aircraft will likely have a manned aircraft and a unmanned companion component. This manned aircraft will do command and control for those drones. It'll kind of act as a intelligence gathering and kind of a central node for the formation, for communication. This would hypothetically, if it works, like they claim, it would be of major benefit to any Chinese military operation against Taiwan. The air and naval battle will be the priority in that fight. So if hypothetically China is able to deploy low-cost drone aircraft, it would potentially help overwhelm Taiwan's defenses. Instead of it being a fighter, it's more probably likely to be a dedicated strike aircraft under the JHXX program. The JXX program is this naming convention given by Western intelligence agencies to describe China's next-gen aircraft programs. At least that's what my handler told me to tell you. The JHXX is a supersonic stealth tactical fighter bomber aircraft. It's hard to tell from the images that we have, but the cockpit seems to potentially be able to hold two pilots sitting next to each other, which is similar to how Russia's Su-34 or America's old F-111 were laid out. Moving on from talking about shapes, one of the weirdest things that you'll notice from this aircraft, that at the least from the outside, is this thing has 3 engines. Even my public school education infantry brain can see that's sort of weird. This comes from the 2 inlets on the bottom side of the plane that closely resembles the J-20s, and a large intake on top, which resembles something like the United States Navy's X-47B, and the 3 visible engine outlets in the back nested into the body of the aircraft. But like all of God's mysteries, there are a ton of reasons as to why that might be. But we do have a pretty good idea as to why they went with 3 engines. China is good at building walls, spyware disguised as short-form video, but what their track record has shown that they're not as great at building is modern fighter engines specifically. Could the J-36 be a start of a new chapter of a super Chinese engines? Some experts are saying that the 3 engines is a new prototype called the WS-10C, which were originally reverse engineered Western CFM56 engines, which are designed by France and the United States. But up until just a few years ago, the majority of aircraft engines built from small fighters to full-on cargo aircraft by China were either less effective imported versions or just copies of Russian designs. When J-20s and J-35s began first flying around, it was noticeable that they had issues with their engines not being able to put out enough thrust for what the aircraft needed. That includes serrated exhaust feathers to help increase stealth and increase that thrust, but more isn't necessarily better. Typically, aircraft designers try to get away with only 1 engine if possible because it keeps things down like cost, weight, and maintenance time. So the decision to go with 3 engines is even more confusing when you look at it from that angle. One analyst speculates that it's possible that the centerline engine could be entirely different than the outboard ones on either side of it. On this design scenario, the center engine would likely be for that subsonic flight, specifically during takeoff and the initial climb, before the aircraft reaches cruising speed and altitude. When it does, the outboard engines, more focused on supersonic flight, would take over. This is a common issue that aircraft designers have to deal with when creating a new aircraft. Engines are typically either better at subsonic flight and agility or supersonic flight, stability, and speed. You can't have your cake and eat your cake too. But one article from the Telegraph gives an even very different take on this. Their claim is that it's laser cannons. With aircraft these days being designed with every bell and whistle you can imagine, and some you can't, it starts getting harder and harder to keep everything on the plane fully powered. You can't run things like avionics and targeting systems off a handful of AA batteries in a dream. So all electrical power in a fighter is generated from the engines. A laser cannon, or really any kind of directed energy weapon, would require what aeronautic experts are referring to as a metric ass load of electricity, more than what could be generated from just 2 engines. China has been putting a lot of effort into creating these kinds of systems lately, with a microwave gun recently reported to have hit targets 2 miles away. And it's not unreasonable to assume that in the coming years, that technology would be small enough now to slap onto the side of a plane of this size. This also isn't some kind of crazy over-the-top idea either, as the United States has not only already begun experimenting with directed energy weapons on fighters, but the US Air Force has already come out and said that laser-style weapons will be a crucial design feature of their own 6th generation fighter. For the most part, any kind of modern directed energy weapon would primarily be for point protection, destroying incoming missiles before they hit. As it stands, no military has really managed to make a laser small enough to fit on an aircraft that could reliably take out other aircraft at a distance. a few seconds of getting zapped with a microwave gun could be enough to fry all the tracking and maneuver electronics and turn an expensive missile into a gliding dud. One thing that you see thrown around in discussions about 6th generation fighters is the integration of drones. Rather than trying to squeeze every capability into a single manned aircraft like on a 4th or 5th generation plane, 6th generation ones usually include some kind of unmanned wingman style drone or a set of drones to be flown with each plane. These are designed to carry weapons, serve as an extra set of eyes, and take on missions that would otherwise be too dangerous, without putting your fancy new flying triangle into actual danger. In December of 2024, China unveiled their FH-97A that would serve this exact purpose and can carry out both air-to-air and air-to-ground munitions. It's also capable of controlling its own smaller FPV drone. It's like a Russian nesting doll of man-made horrors beyond comprehension. One interesting design choice are the 18 distinct segments on the back of the fuselage. Theoretically, these would be used to control the aircraft's maneuvering. Having 18 separate control surfaces is another case of complicating the design in order to achieve a certain level of performance, I think, and this could be an indication that Chinese Air Force doesn't expect to have the thrust vectoring on their engines anytime soon. If that's the case, China seems to be really brute forcing the on-paper capabilities of this aircraft. The United States Air Force for years now has been fairly open about China having a real capability in building a future 6th generation aircraft. Back in 2022, General Mark Kelly, head of the Air Combat Command, said China was actively pursuing an NGAD-style program themselves. He described it as an exponential reduction in signature, exponential acceleration of processing power, and sensing, end quote. That said, those are also things I would say if I was trying to secure funding from Congress for my own new fighter jet. So we'll have to see. But what do you guys think? Is this another piece of gear to drop in the Chinese knockoff pile, or is it something that could have some weight behind it? Let me know what you think in the comments. I'm your average infantryman, Chris Cappy. Follow me on Instagram at CappyArmy. Signing off this net, time now.